Welcome everyone. It is now 1 p.m. Central Time, so we're going to get started with today's presentation. I just want to take a minute to thank everybody for joining us today on our presentation about loss prevention best practices. My name is Peyton Berger with Delaget, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we get to the presentation, I just want to cover a couple quick housekeeping items. First, all of today's participants will be on mute for the duration of the presentation. So if at any time you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A box on the right-hand side in the GoToWebinar panel. If there's time at the end of the presentation, we'll host a Q&A session and then respond to any questions at that time. We do have quite a few people on the webinar today, so if we don't get to your specific question, please feel free to reach out to one of us individually and we'll definitely get you the answer to your question. Also, I want everyone to know that today's presentation is being recorded and it will be provided to you along with a copy of the slides in a follow-up email from me in a couple of days. So just watch your email for that. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be presented with a short 4-question survey. We'd really appreciate it if you just took a minute to let us know what you thought of today's presentation so we can continue to make future webinars as valuable as possible for you. Also, we're going to be live tweeting during the webinar today, so we encourage you to join in the conversation and use the hashtag DelagetLPWebinar, which will be in the top right-hand corner of every slide, so you'll be able to reference that if you want to join in. And with that, we'll get started. I will introduce you to today's presenter. Ed Heskett is a loss prevention manager here at Delaget, who has more than 30 years of experience in a variety of above-store leader roles in the restaurant industry. Throughout his career, Ed has developed, implemented, and used loss prevention tools to improve restaurant operations and profitability in a number of stores across 4 different brands. He has been working with Delaget as a loss prevention expert for over 15 years now, training and assisting restaurant operators with the implementation of loss prevention tactics and software. Thanks for joining us, Ed, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Peyton. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Let me begin today's webinar by saying that in your current mode of operation, you're losing money to theft for sure, and most certainly experiencing loss due to operational breakdowns and failed system execution. In today's webinar, I will share several best practices, all operational in nature, that when implemented and executed will improve your performance and protect your profits. So moving on to today's agenda, I'm going to answer the question, actually several answers to the question, what is loss prevention? What does it mean to us? Discuss most common methods of theft, loss prevention best practices, POS metrics, additional tips to curb theft. And I will tell you up front here, the gist of today's webinar is best practices as it relates to interviewing and hiring, onboarding and training, scheduling, and then specific to the POS metrics in protecting your profits. So we start by answering the question, well, first asking the question, what is loss prevention? First and foremost, I guess, it's guarding against theft, fraud, and loss due to ignorance or improper training. And when I speak of ignorance, I'm not talking about stupidity here. I'm talking about people that just don't have the information necessary to do their job at an acceptable or even a higher level. It's everything customer and employee safety, improving margin, improving employee morale. Oftentimes, employees who steal feel they have been wronged or cheated by the organization, perhaps someone in the organization, that prompts them to start the process that, you know what, you can't pay me enough to work here in these conditions, so I'm going to help myself to something in this restaurant and perhaps on a recurring basis. So very important to have systems and practices in place to help foster a great employer environment and prevent you from being in that situation. Loss prevention tools, when properly executed, are a great time saver. And you think about, as a restaurant leader, an owner, an operator, bus store leader, in drafting your quarterly or period or weekly schedule, I think it's fair to say that none of us are factoring in time to conduct investigations. Those are always things that are handed to us, perhaps something that we stumble upon that require our time and energy away from what we've originally scheduled ourselves to do. So a great loss prevention program can help keep you on track by uncovering fraud, potential theft early and addressing it, as opposed to having to do it in an investigation format. In addition, sharpening your operation, allowing your LP program to work for you so you can take care of your team and your guests, as opposed to those investigations that sneak up on you, as I just mentioned. At the end of the day, loss prevention is discipline. The next slide. And when I say discipline, I get right back to one of the definitions in the dictionary that really helps me understand and define what our role is in loss prevention and operations in general. And that is training and coaching or action that develops self-control, orderliness, and efficiency. And you think about those terms, it covers training and development of the team, coaching of the team, and then action to keep everyone honest and to keep everything on the up and up. And in the failure to do that, and then we're talking about documentation and taking steps to correct the situation with a little bit more force. Additionally, loss prevention is teaching the policies and procedures to the entire team. They're clearly defining the roles and responsibilities as it relates to the accountability, creating, adjusting, and defining thresholds, having systems in place to monitor those thresholds at the employee level, the restaurant level, the above restaurant level, and the company level, and then modeling your expectations. And this is often taken for granted if considered at all, the power that we have as leaders in setting a great example for our team. There's a great Ralph Waldo Emerson quote from years and years ago to really reinforce this, and that is that what you do speaks so loudly I cannot hear what you're saying. And you know what, whether we like it or not as leaders, our team is watching us. And what they learn in terms of what we value is what they see us doing versus what we're saying. So I would ask anybody that's in a position where they're leading people that they understand the power of modeling their own expectations. So then the question comes, are your employees really stealing from you? And I found over the years that RGMs and AGMs and below, shift manager level, they have a tendency to believe that their employees are really loyal to them and they wouldn't steal. And we found employees at all level of loyalty that have in fact stolen something at some point in time. And you see here on the slide, the truth in the numbers is several studies that have been done across the country, different organizations, Chamber of Commerce and such. 75% of your past and current employees have stolen cash or product at least once. That's a pretty scary number. 54% of current employees eat for free. And indeed, here lately, we are finding more fraud at the employee discount level than any other area. And we'll touch a bit on that later. And then 34% of your employees have witnessed theft. And this is really a scary number because typically it's employees that wouldn't even think of stealing, high-level employees, and maybe they bring it to a manager's attention, maybe they don't. And oftentimes they found that they don't, and they either work there and allow it to happen, bad deal, or they move on, they leave, and you've got all that time and energy invested into them at that point, and you've lost all of that by virtue of the theft that's occurring, and that's not something that they want to be part of. So again, this all dials back into having the discipline and the control around your metrics to prevent or reduce all three of these numbers posted here. So first order of business, we're going to talk about different methods of theft, and we'll touch on the gist of today's webinar, as I mentioned earlier, is theft at the POS level. So I wanted to summarize that before we get into more detail on it. We're looking at deletions, cancels, and voids. And what I'm talking about there, the language is different depending upon your POS platform. But by and large, deletions, cancels, and voids are the things that happen that are altering guest checks during the order taking process. So that's one area of theft or potential theft at the POS level. The other is in promos and discounts, overrings, voids and refunds, and all three of those, overrings, voids, and refunds, typically done after the tender key, and we'll touch base on that as well. And then handing food over the counter, and then just flat out either stealing the cash or losing the cash because the policies are not properly followed. Other forms of theft include, and this will be one for a future webinar, inventory manipulation and the theft of raw product. Oftentimes the manipulation of the inventory stems from cover-up for theft of raw product or cover-up from theft through the POS metrics that we've mentioned on the previous slide. Stealing supplies. This is something that I just asked you to consider, to have some sort of system in place, because many folks don't pay this a whole lot of credence. But if you think about the supplies in your stores and how attractive they might be to somebody at home, somebody that camps, owns a camper, perhaps a cabin, you've got service trays, you've got garbage bags, cleaning supplies, paper towels, all those things can be really attractive to folks to use in those settings that I've mentioned, which would in turn drive your supplies up. And I can assure you, if they're stealing supplies, they have already stolen food and perhaps money, and if they haven't, they will be starting shortly. And then time and uniforms. And recent studies have suggest that time represents 10 to 15% of fraud conducted in your restaurant, and fraudulent punches, people milking the clock, if you will, and other varieties of time clock fraud. And that as well may be a topic for a future webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Peyton for a polling question, and then we'll get into hiring best practices.
All right, thank you, Ed. That brings us to our first polling question. How confident are you that your loss prevention plan is reducing theft and fraud in your organization? A, very confident. Our loss prevention plan is a well-oiled thief-catching machine. Are you somewhat confident that your loss prevention plan helps detect some loss, but it could use some areas of improvement? Or are you not confident and you still need to implement a loss prevention plan? If you could just take a few moments to answer that in your GoToWebinar panel on the right side, I will leave that open for a few seconds and then we'll jump right back into the presentation. All right, I'll hand it back to you now, Ed.
Okay, our first category for best practices in loss preventions begins with hiring best practices. And a couple points that I want to make on this slide. And the first one is candidates with previous restaurant experience or brand experience, perhaps a rehire within your own city and organization, or someone that's transferring from outside your market. Is that a quick fix or is it a red flag? And the answer to that question in both cases is yes. I have found more oftentimes than not that when rehiring employees, transfers from outside the marketplace, within the city, whatever the case might be, even with retail or restaurant experience, while that might be a quick fix, managers think that, hey, it's somebody that's going to hit the ground running for me. I don't have to, quote unquote, train them. They'll be ready to go. I've almost always found that they come with some sort of baggage, keeping in mind that they left their previous job or even your company and want to come back for a reason that may include theft and or other operational issues or behavioral issues such as attendance, punctuality, those types of things that while not causing you theft issues or loss in that regard, it's going to cost you lost time and energy and all the time and money it's going to take to get them from point A to point B. So to police that or to support the restaurant teams in that, as an above store leader for many, many years, my approach with rehires and transfers was to partner with my RGMs and basically have an approval level in place just to make sure that they're asking the right questions, that they're checking the references, running down whatever feedback they can get on this individual, and oftentimes even interview the candidate myself just to get a feel for how I feel they would fit in with our organization or our particular restaurant. So that's a great best practice that can keep your managers sharp, help develop them in asking the right questions, and put you in a better position to make a better hiring decision on those types of candidates. At the employee level, reference checks often gone undone. Difficult to get, I understand. Oftentimes a reference check is requested and we're talking to an individual that won't give us any information or can't remember the candidate that we're referring to. And after 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 failures, the RGMs making those calls, they give up because they're not getting information. And that's really, really a mistake. Anybody that's hired into our organization, we should do our level best to make sure that we've checked their references. And those should be documented and on record in the event that we need them, and continue to coach our team through that. Food service background, again, oftentimes appealing, oftentimes a detriment, so we need to be mindful of that. And then at the manager level, and I would imagine that everybody on this webinar today is here at least with criminal background checks. Any internal promote, regardless of how long they've been on your team or how long you've known them, or external hire should clearly be cleared of a criminal background activity by virtue of a background check, either at the time of the promotion or as a condition of their employment. And then pre-employment drug testing for internal promotes and for sure external hires. And by doing those two things, you're really guarding yourself against hiring trouble right at the get-go. So some best practices there on the hiring side. From an onboarding standpoint, I've always encouraged operators, and I have myself a long time ago, to hire all employees as food champions or line personnel, whatever it is that your organization calls them, cooks, production, whatever the case might be. And I'm speaking specifically about cashiers. And to do that, you need to be really thoughtful in planning understanding what your hiring and scheduling needs are and planning accordingly. Today's Wednesday. If you're interviewing and hiring a candidate today and you're planning on them running your drive-through register on Friday night dinner, that's a mistake. That's a real mistake. They're not going to be ready, and it's going to be a disservice to you, to them, to the folks working that night, and certainly to all the guests on the other end of their transactions. So as this is up here on the slide and you think through this, allow the cashiers, when they're hired, to have some exposure to the line, train them as line people, give them the opportunity to learn the product ingredients, the product bills, and help them formulate in their mind what questions will be asked and how to answer them when the guests are placing orders when they do get to the register. It'll help them develop confidence in all of the menu knowledge, be better equipped to deal with those guest issues. It'll make for a more fluid transaction when they get to the register, fewer mistakes, less deletions, improved customer experience, and less for the opportunity for fraud. Experience firsthand how the line operations work with each other at the cashier flow to the line flow and vice versa. And then a real great benefit is to have more flexibility in the scheduling and then to offer variety to your team members. Oftentimes we lose folks, don't necessarily know it at the time, because there's a perceived lack of variety in what they do at the restaurant, their particular job, and perhaps we are, for lack of a better term, too lazy to train them to do something else. If we do that up front, they're engaged, they look forward to coming to work, happy employees basically generate happy guests. In addition to that, you keep them out of the mode that I'd mentioned earlier, where they get in a rut. You can't pay me enough to do this, so I'm going to start stealing because you owe this to me, coming in here and standing here and running the drive-thru all day or running the front register or whatever the case might be. So great way to keep your people fresh and it's a great way to prepare your cashiers for success as part of their training. Next, in the training side, is to use certified trainers. I'm sure that most of the folks in this webinar in the restaurants are doing this. If not a certified team trainer, certainly somebody that's qualified in the position to do the training, followed by what most organizations use, some sort of online training to give an overview of the position at the very least. Most POS platforms, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, have a practice mode, underutilized in my view, and I would encourage cashiers, after they've had an initiation to the line, how to make the food and have that product knowledge, that they spend some time with a crew trainer, perhaps a manager or a lead cashier type, in the practice mode on the register, and learn to navigate around the register and to do some role playing. And as I say this, I want you to think about three things that are happening at the register as part of taking a guest order. First is the greeting of the guest, the welcoming of the guest, and the guest interaction. And if you've done your diligence in the hiring decision or sliding perhaps a production person to the register, they already have those hospitality traits. So that should really be a given at that point. The one thing that may or may not be given, depending upon what you've done to develop them, is the menu knowledge piece that I've mentioned earlier. So that would be number one. Number two at the register, and this is where the practice mode and the role playing is so important, navigating the keyboard. Most POS systems, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 screens that the cashiers need to be able to maneuver through to get the guest order correct. So having the knowledge, the menu knowledge, and the confidence to be able to do that and maintain a high level of hospitality at the guest, very, very important in terms of having a fluid transaction and getting the order correct. And then tendering the order, cash or credit card, and screening for counterfeit bills, making sure that cashiers understand what your policy is for screening counterfeit bills, something that we've seen here in the Twin Cities, high activity here in the last several weeks of all denominations, $5 all the way to $100 bills. And then tendering credit cards incorrectly, and you think to yourself, and this is taken for granted, we see it in training where, well, everybody knows how to tender a credit card. I can tell you that I've seen two examples just here in the last few weeks where we've done exactly what I had mentioned earlier. We hired a cashier on Wednesday. We put on the drive-through cashier on Friday night dinner. There's nobody shadowing them. There's nobody really available to answer questions for them. And they're tendering credit cards and nothing's happening. They can't get the tender to work. So then they're tendering them backwards is what they were doing. Then they're hitting the cash tender button, tendering the order at 0, and then they're handing the receipt and the credit card back to the guest thinking that they've tendered the order. The cash goes out, and lo and behold, we find out at the end of their shift that we're $350 short cash because we tendered all those orders at 0. Don't fall victim to this, and you think that'll never happen to you. I can assure you the folks that this happened to didn't think that would ever happen to them. It wasn't intentional, it wasn't theft, but it was certainly loss. And then shadow the employees. I just mentioned that, to making sure that when you're turning people loose after they've done all the training and the education, the practice and the role playing, as you're turning them loose to run the register, let's make sure that they have somebody shadowing them, somebody in their back pocket, or at the very least, they have a name and a location of somebody to find in the event that they have a question. Oftentimes, cashiers learn how to steal just through trial and error on the keyboard because they're not properly trained. And you can protect yourself against that by having them properly trained up front and out of that mode of trial and error. Scheduling and deployment, next list of best practices. And we start this with the thought of minimizing the opportunity for too many hands in the till. And this really begins with the RGM, or the principal schedule writer in the restaurant. I have found over the years that the average weekly schedule is done, as a weekly activity versus a weekly business plan, and not enough thought given into who is scheduled and deployed and when. I would imagine that most folks on the webinar today are dealing with extended hours of operation and drive-through restaurant. So we're talking about breakfast or late night or both, or just extended hours that take us into 12 or 15 hours of operation a day. And if you're dealing with a drive-through and you've got at least 2 registers on your front counter, to protect the number of hands that are in a till during the course of a day and a shift, you will need to deploy 8 to 10 cashiers each day, and preferably keeping them on shorter shifts to keep them fresh and to be able to isolate any potential issues, fraud, or questionable behavior on their till. So that's one best practice. Another is that cross-training piece that I'd mentioned earlier, and put them in a position where they're scheduled shorter shifts. And I'm going to touch more on that when we're talking about deletions here in a few minutes. And then deploy multiple drive-through order takers. Have them available. Oftentimes, not so much this time of year because we're getting to the peak portion of our business, but late night, off hours, or any opportunity that you have where you've got one drive-through cashier deployed. My experience has taught me that when there is support needed, when they get busy at that drive-through by themselves, support always drifts to the register as opposed to the order taker. And oftentimes during a 5 or 6 or 8 hour shift at drive-through, there's as many as 5 or 6 different hands in that cash drawer, along with the person that's assigned to it. You know, the question is, who do you hold accountable for cash loss or fraudulent activity on that drawer, and how do you do that? The answer is really you can't. So protecting yourself through some great scheduling practices will allow you the opportunity to do that. Schedule overlap time. So you've got at shift change, you allow oncoming cashiers to count their drawer prior to taking orders on their fresh drawer, and then you allow the departing cashier to count their drawer at the end of their shift, still able to leave on time. So you schedule accordingly, and the example here is if you've got a cashier scheduled out at 4 o'clock, schedule them off the floor at 3:55. So their drawer can be settled and documented, and they're out the door at 4 o'clock. See, all too often employees get frustrated because they're scheduled to 4 o'clock, the drawer isn't pulled to 4 o'clock or afterwards, and it's 4:15, 4:30, 20 to 5, whatever the case is. They're still on your clock, that much additional time extra, which is robbing your time that we've mentioned earlier. Or worse, or just as bad, they're running out the door for another job or another appointment, and their cash drawer goes unsettled. Oftentimes that drawer gets pulled immediately and we find a shortage. Who's it on? The person cashing the drawer or the person that just ran out the door? Or the drawer stays in place for the next cashier, adding another level of accountability to anything that was done to that drawer under the previous individual's name. So schedule that overlap that time. Be really mindful as you're building your daily schedules into what time, first, how many cashiers you have scheduled, but then what time are they coming and they going, and is there time for the oncoming cashiers to count their drawers and the departing cashiers to count their drawer and still be in a position to leave their shift on time. And then I mentioned earlier, consider implementing a head cashier. I've worked with organizations in the past that have had head cashiers, perhaps a shift lead type crew trainer, maybe a cashier that's been with you for a period of time, somebody that you would run a criminal background check on, that would have either a swipe card or a manager card, whatever it is your organization POS platform uses, to help facilitate some of the managerial functions on the register that needs to get done in the manager's absence, to be that immediate coach and support to cashiers, and especially newer cashiers. So that takes us to the POS metrics that I had mentioned earlier. And I want to speak first about deletions, voids, and cancels. And again, depending upon your POS platform, it's typically called one of those three things. And we're talking about anything that happens to the guest check during the order taking process. And time and again, I've heard operators really discount deletions before as an avenue to steal. And I will say this: one, I've caught countless people stealing using deletions before. Granted, it typically takes two people at least to do that, but we've caught it, we've seen it, still do see it. And I've seen also where people are using before deletions to come up with certain scenarios that they can steal with later. So guarding yourself against high deletions before can guard you against the theft opportunity. I would tell you that, and we all know this, not all deletions and voids and cancels are theft. In fact, most of them aren't. So we need to be really careful here. What they are, though, when they're not theft, is a sign of poor training or lack of menu knowledge. You rarely see a manager running a cash drawer or a very tenured, well-trained cashier with deletion issues. So poor training, lack of menu knowledge, inattentive cashiering, horseplay, anything along those lines that is going to make for a struggling transaction with the guest. It's going to slow down your line operations because there's going to be questions, mistakes, clarifications. Perhaps the order that's prepared gets to the front counter and we find out that it's not made correctly or it's not the right order, then it's got to go back to where it came from and be made properly. So now you have a waste issue and you've got speed of service issues with the line breakdown. So a well-trained cashier with well-controlled deletions will help you control those type of situations and improve your speed of service and your performance. We've all seen deletions, breakdowns at the register create frustrated employees, either on the line or at the register right there dealing with the guest. And frustrated employees almost always result in a compromised customer experience or even a frustrated customer. One thing I would ask you to think about, and I see this all too often, managers and cashiers, as you're coaching them on deletions, if there is a point in time where they are blaming the customer for their deletions, you really need to calibrate them on their behavior, their expectations, and their customer experience commitment and their knowledge of the register system. And then back to the scheduling piece. If you're in a restaurant where you feel as though you've got a clientele that is more challenging than perhaps another restaurant that you worked in or other restaurants in your area, and you're scheduling cashiers to work the drive-through from 6 o'clock on a Friday night till 5 o'clock Saturday morning, an 11-hour shift on the drive-through, perhaps by themselves most of the night, without a break, and admit it or not, it's happening. I see it all too often in restaurants that I've supervised it, coached against it. What quality guest experience is any guest getting at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning from somebody that's been on the register in those conditions? And then certainly dealing with guests that are more challenging, by virtue of the situation that we've put our people in or even ourselves in, we have not done ourselves a service to run the kind of numbers and have the kind of customer experience that we would like to have. So consider that back to the scheduling piece that I'd mentioned earlier, especially in those tough situations. And then I just want to add the really scary deletions. And typically, but not always, we see these associated with lull periods, mid-afternoon, more often than not, mid-evening and late night. Anything before, after, or canceled to zero is a scary proposition from a theft standpoint. We might see them hit and miss, but seeing them over time or seeing them back to back, certainly an indication that you might have some underringing going on with a cashier and or management person. Next up, from a POS metric standpoint, is overrings. Overrings typically used to correct mistakes, refund a guest purchase, cover cash shortages, or just flat out stealing the cash. In terms of mistakes, encourage your cashiers to slow down, repeat the order, get the order right. Don't tender it until they get or they recognize what the guest presentation for payment is, cash or credit card. I can assure you that if we slow down at the register, ask the right questions, clarify the order before we hit the total button and tender button, and then make sure we tender cash as cash and credit as credit and get that right, you will reduce 80% of your overrings. Every time we're doing an overring in front of a cashier, we're teaching them, whether we like it or not, we're teaching and role modeling for them an avenue to steal. They can memorize the manager code, and believe me, I found plenty of fraud in the overring refund key by cashiers using managers' codes. And perhaps some of you folks on this call have seen that as well. So guarding against that through clean, crisp register transactions can help guard against that part of it. Mistakes, the other side of that is the mistakes resulting in overrings and voids, again, like deletions, disruptive to your line operations. When an overring is done, it typically requires two people, the cashier and the manager in charge. So now the manager in charge has to be taken away from what they're doing, and seemingly this is always during a rush. So now you've taken somebody off a production line to deal with something that had been done properly up front, again, through training and the technical expertise on the register, could have been avoided in the first place. And like the deletions, when it comes to refunding and voids and overrings, watch for the timing. Typically, we find the most fraud in lull periods, and usually on the drive-through side, but not always, late evening and late night. Validate all overrings with 2 receipts. Not always available, but when available, you should have the original receipt and the void or refund receipt. Credit card purchases that result in a refund should be refunded to the credit card. I realize occasionally they will be done in cash. That should be discouraged. And when you see a specific cashier with behavior that suggests that they are refunding credit cards to cash nearly all the time, you may have a theft or a fraudulent situation occurring that would need to be addressed. For refunds, get the guest signature. I can't think of a retail setting out there that I've requested a refund where the retailer hasn't asked me for my signature when I'm getting money back. And we are a retail establishment. We should be in the same operating mode and have that level of accountability, not only for the guest, but for the cashier and the manager in charge. And then whatever your thresholds are for overrings, voids, and refunds, and I'm talking about a percentage of sales, either for a cashier or looking at a day or a week or a period for your restaurant or your organization. Lower your thresholds wherever there are. Try to get to a better place. 0.25% was a goal at one point in time. I know for Taco Bell corporate. I know Taco Bell organizations that are down to 0.10 and 0.08% of their sales by really honing in on it and holding the team accountable for the training that I'd mentioned earlier and for the results that they're posting each day. And you really guard yourself against theft. And when you do that, when you're dialed in to that degree with any one of these metrics, and we're talking about overrings here, the well-controlled overring void activity really makes the fraudulent activity stand out and easier to isolate and identify. That takes us to a really busy screen, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where we see the most fraud because there's just so much going on with discounts. So what I want to do is basically talk through a list of best practices here that pretty much touches on each of the bubbles on the screen that you see in front of you. First step is if your POS platform, requires swipe cards, make it a point that the team understands the swipe cards belong on the manager's person. And any activity that's done the register should be completed by the manager in charge. If you're going to give your cashiers a swipe card to perform a manager function on the register, you might as well just give them a swipe card, right? It's a license to steal. And I've uncovered early on in my LP career theft with cashiers just picking up swipe cards laying on the counter and performing manager functions and stealing that way. So don't be in a position where you're allowing that to happen or excusing it away. And then second would be register codes. Changing when compromised, and they're compromised daily. And I know some Taco Bell operators that are really sharp on this, where they change their manager register codes daily to protect the managers to their profits and to protect the employees for that matter. But change them daily, change them regularly, change them when compromised, come up with your own system or policy. Just make sure that you're in a position where it's the manager that's using their specific code. Then the second step would be to clearly define what your company or store policy is for discounting. And I've worked with several organizations on adding more specifics to what discounting looks like in their restaurant. So typically we see 100% meal discount for managers, 50% employee, and there might be 50% for police in some situations or 50% military, and then a senior discount, and some organizations use 20% for off-duty employees to enjoy a meal on their brand with the family. But have those clearly defined. And then at the employee level, excuse me, have two different limits on employee meals. One is for employee and manager meals, one order, one employee, one guest check, and then put a dollar amount on it, $7, $8 in terms of a discount. So now, as a general rule, when you're looking at discount activity, you're seeing one employee meal for $7 or $8 or less likely to be fraud. Doesn't mean that there can't be fraud in there, but much less likely that it will be fraud. When you get into a situation, and again, typically we see this late night, late evening, and lull time in the afternoon, especially on weekends, when you're looking at activity that is double-digit discounting at the employer-manager level, something's going on there. Either theft or fraud, or quite honestly, you have the opportunity to protect yourself against that loss by clearly defining what your discounting policies are for meals, and then lowering the dollar amounts allowed. Assuming that most folks use manager meal discounting for customer recovery and employee training during limited time offers, being in the situation where the people on your staff are allowed to make the food to learn how to make it, obviously, but to be able to sample it and understand it. So anything that's made that goes over the counter should be rung in as a manager meal or employee meal discount. And then I would add that discounts are rung in prior to consumption, and no one, and I mean no one, from the owner all the way down to the employees, should ever be in a position where they're making their own food. So the food's rung in, the people that are working the line are making the food, and the order gets served. And I know we've got a bus store leaders that work in organizations, we've got restaurant leaders that work in organizations. Nobody can make my food like I like it, so I'm going to make it. Bad deal. By making your own food, you are, back to that role model point that I made earlier, you are modeling behavior for your team that is detrimental to the profitability of your restaurant. If you, as a leader in your restaurant, can make your own food, rung in or not, I can assure you, you are stamping that level of approval for your team as well. And while it might be rung in initially, sooner or later it'll get to the point, and we've seen this, where they'll be making their food that's not rung in, and then that graduates into making it and bringing it home, or making it and giving it to friends and families. And you've got theft going on that you can't account for in the POS system, but you will certainly see it in your product cost variance and on your cost of goods. So consider that when it comes to employee and manager meal discounting. Nobody makes their own food. Strongly discourage you, if you are, from using manager meal discounts to cover up for mistakes, to basically falsify your product cost variance. It may, at the end of the day, look like your cost of sales variance is favorable, when in fact, when you're looking at your net cost of goods on your P&L, it won't be as favorable. So mistakes, cost of doing business, need to log it, need to understand it and share with the team. Accounting for it with a manager meal, big mistake, and I would suggest that you don't do it. That too will grow into employees making mistakes on purpose, certainly followed with a question of, can I take this food home or can I eat it? And again, like I mentioned with discounts, or I'm sorry, with overrings, when it comes to discounts, lower your threshold. And I've seen organizations that have used 1.25% as their threshold for discounts. And I've seen that by doing the things that I've mentioned earlier, protecting the swipe cards, the manager codes, lowering the amount that can be discounted, and clearly defining what discounts look like, taking the company level on a extremely large company, taking their annual discounts from 1.25% to less than 1% is significant savings, and then all of the peripheral savings that you have from potential theft when people know that you're looking that hard. And then manage the documentation is the final piece on that I want to make on discounting. You're settling a cash drawer. Oftentimes we're too quick to look at the cash amount that we need to close out the drawer, when in fact we should be working our way down the tape and understanding what the level of deletions are. Here we're talking about discounting. If the the registered shift close receipt says that there are 8 meal discounts on that register, there should be 8 receipts. And if there's not, then you need to get after the cashier and the manager in charge. In most cases, it's the manager in charge that's responsible for ringing up those manager meals. If you've got missing documentation, you've got missing cash. And you make that your expectation in your behavior, and you will clean up that discount fraud. And then promos, variety of different promos, things that happen throughout independent and group restaurants and DMAs. And just ask that you're validating promos with redeemed and destroyed coupons as part of the settlement tape, and then monitoring that behavior. Okay, we can move on to the next slide, Peyton. Some additional helpful best practices. This is for above store leaders. We'll start there. As an above store leader, dedicate some time each week to monitoring, following up on your POS results. Certainly daily, as you're looking at your numbers, if you see anything that sticks out. But what you might not see daily is some sort of trend that's happening over time. As an above store leader for years and years, I would dedicate some time, typically on a Saturday morning, to dig into a little deeper the restaurant's performance on the metrics that we've been talking about here, the deletions and voids, overrings and discounts, and uncovering fraud in a more controlled setting, and getting after it that way. And then in addition, as an above store leader, following up on the store level paperwork every visit. Let the team know that you're looking every day, or bring their information to meetings, and you can rotate it through, and you can look at each other's information and learn from each other. But don't let that daily paperwork go unsupervised, if you will, at the above store leader level. The store level team must own the follow-up, shift to shift, day to day. And, let's face it, from an accountability standpoint, anything that we see in above store leader reporting happens at the shift level and the day level first. So partnering with your team, getting them to understand the importance of looking at the information every single day, every single shift, and then communicating up for support as necessary. Very, very valuable. Trend results over time. Don't know what kind of systems are out there, but there are several. But looking at cashiers over a period of a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, and really understand what their level of POS activity is over time. And occasionally you find out that it's a specific day that they have issues, or maybe none at all. Maybe it was a specific shift. But you really understand what your cashiers are doing and when they're doing it, when you're looking at their performance over time. Watch for drawer keys in use during cashier manager shifts. This is really, really scary. Like a swipe card, I wouldn't give a set of manager keys to a cashier to get into a drawer. The manager should discipline themselves to walk through the cash drawer, open the cash drawer with their keys, and do what needs to be done, and then take their keys back. You see a key in a cash drawer during a shift, you have a potential theft problem that needs to be addressed. More helpful best practices, watch for low drink sales percent. Over the years, I've looked at drink sales, beverage sales in two different avenues. One is using an average of 0.7 beverages per transaction, and yours might be higher or might be lower in your organization, but comparing your cashiers, whatever your restaurant's average is, looking at somebody that's significantly less than that may mean a theft opportunity. And then a percentage of 15% is another way to look at it. And yours might be higher, it might be lower for whatever reason, but isolating cashiers that are significantly less than other cashiers or that are less than your restaurant's average, a great way to isolate what may be theft on the beverage side of your business. Watch for cash overages and bounces. A general rule of thumb on cash overages is you don't want it bouncing from one day to the next. And I know Taco Bell Corporate, for example, years ago set the threshold that 50% of the days shouldn't have cash over any amount, and then 25% of the days over the course of a week or a period shouldn't have cash over or short more than $5. And as you're trending your business over the course of time, a week, 2 weeks, or a period, if you see cash bouncing in and around those thresholds, you may have somebody manipulating, the final deposit each night and helping themselves to cash. Conducting surprise cash audits, both during a shift and off hours, great best practice. Monitor late night POS activity. Typically, late night transactions are steady, all things being equal. And typically we see check averages increase pretty dramatically in some cases, in many cases, late night. So as you're looking at your late night business, is the transaction count consistent from day to day or from weekend day to weekend day, looking at it over time? And are your check averages consistent? Are you seeing increments of time, 15 or 20 or half hour increments of time where there are no transactions? Great way to isolate questionable behavior on your register. And then motivate through competition, tracking performance, posting the comparative performance for your team so they can see how everybody's performing. Oftentimes, people will perform for no other reason other than they don't want to be at the bottom of a list. And then finally, disciplined behavior. We walk by questionable behavior all the time, multiple hands in drawers, discounting issues, and we allow it because there's no major loss. Doing yourself and your team a disservice by being undisciplined in that regard. So when you see a breakdown in whatever your posted policies are, get back to that discipline definition that I covered earlier and provide the coaching and the teaching and the training to create the structure. And if the behavior continues without the loss, then there might come to discipline. But waiting for a loss to address the behavior is a mistake and a disservice to you, your team, and your organization. So just to recap what we've covered here today, a well-defined loss prevention program is executed daily at the shift level, improves operations, improves guest metrics, and reduces mistakes due to ignorance, carelessness, and improper and incomplete training, prevents operational loss and theft, and we're done. And that's it for the recap. I'm going to turn it back over to Peyton.
All right, thank you, Ed. That brings us to our final polling question for the day. Are you interested in having a conversation with Delaget about how we can help you improve your loss prevention strategy? Just a yes or no answer, and you can go ahead and answer that now. After a couple seconds, we'll move into the question portion of the webinar. So if you do have any questions, be sure to enter those into the chat box on the webinar panel as well. I'll check it right now. Looks like we have one here, Ed. They're saying you did not mention video surveillance as a part of loss prevention. What are your thoughts on that?
Great question. I did not mention video surveillance, and that is a valuable tool, both in deterring theft when your team knows that they're on camera at a variety of different angles, and also during investigations to be able to investigate and validate, if you will, behavior. So if you're in a situation where you have video surveillance, DVR surveillance, great tool. It's great to revisit that as investigations, and if you're not, it's certainly something I would strongly consider.
Great, thanks, Ed. We have another one here. It says, you mentioned trending results over time. How much time should you be watching for trends, and which metrics should you be looking at?
I think when you're speaking of looking at cashiers, any of the POS metrics that I had mentioned earlier, deletions, discounts, overrings, and voids, and I would start with 10 days to 2 weeks, and oftentimes starting there, if you're seeing suspicious behavior, you're going to want to go a little deeper, as much as a period, 4 weeks. I have, when I've done work for organizations and done initial investigations, I start at the 60 to 90 day mark to really get a feel for what the cashiers are doing over that period of time.
Okay, what is a good number that you suggest for a threshold for deletions or discounts?
I think that discounts, depending upon the organization and the level of discounting, if you're in the 0.75% of sales to 1%, you're probably in a pretty safe area. If you're getting much more than 1% as an area of restaurants or as a larger group of restaurants, I would do what I'd mentioned in the presentation and really look at what your discounting policy is and get your arms around that. From a deletion standpoint, it depends on your POS platform. Generally speaking, somewhere between 4 and 6% is a great place to be from deletions. It doesn't mean that theft or fraud won't occur within that 4 to 6%, but you're in a much better place with it in that 4 to 6% to account for mistakes in the order taking and training and those types of things.
All right. In the interest of time, we'll end with questions today, but if you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us after the webinar and we'll definitely get you those answers. Just want to say thanks to Ed one more time. There was lots of valuable information in today's presentation. And just a reminder to everybody on the webinar that the presentation was recorded and I will be sending it to you along with a copy of the slides in a couple of days. So just watch your email for that and you should be getting it soon. For additional information on Delaget solutions that can help you enhance your loss prevention plan, visit us at delaget.com. And that concludes our webinar for today. I just want to remind you that there will be a short survey appearing after the webinar. So if you could take a couple minutes to answer that, that would be great. Thank you all for joining us and have a great afternoon.